tend to make? Is it any fact? Is it facts about what morality is?
It's like based on like something quantified, like a number, like how many people died from domestic violence like this year.
That is true. It is oftentimes based on what is quantifiable. Oftentimes based on statistics. If I wanted to make an empirical claim about how many people in this room are wearing t-shirts, is that necessarily based on statistics?
Yes.
It might be, but I think the more general understanding of what empirical means is probably more useful. I think an empirical claim is something that is verifiable by observation or experience about the world that is not necessarily deduced by simply using logic and thought. It requires examining features of the world and drawing conclusions about the reality of the world, based upon, and this is important, observation and experience. So if I were to say the claim, morality entails that all agents are equal, is that an empirical claim? You in the turquoise t-shirt with black.
No.
No? And why?
Because it's not something like quantifiable and not something like based on knowledge or like experience.
Was it not based on knowledge?
I mean, not something verifiable.
Well, it is based in knowledge. I do know, or could know, that morality assumes that all agents are equal. But what I do like about that is the word verifiable. There's something that has to be testable about an empirical claim. So can we refine that answer? Why is the sentence, morality requires all humans are equal, not an empirical claim?
Do you like reason that and experience it?
Yeah, we didn't experience it. We didn't observe this fact about the world. It's something born out of my brain using logic and deduction. So if I made the claim, half of the people that usually leave the debate can't say they're never going to return ever again. Is that an empirical claim? Yes? Why?
Because you experienced that, or you observed it and came to that conclusion.
Can you say that louder so everyone else can hear your answer?
You experienced that and you came to that conclusion based on your observations.
That is a perfect answer. So, in debate, we use empirical claims to justify observations we would like to make about the real world. That said, can I just stand up in a debate round and say, you know what, 100% of women who use, women or men, or anyone, who uses deadly force in response to repeated domestic violence, 100% of the time, it results in the abuser being killed. Can I just say that?
No,
Why can't I just say that?
because you need a warrant.
I need a warrant. Can we refine that answer a little bit? Why would it be problematic if I just asserted? Yeah, if I'm making an observation about the real world, and I myself am somehow unqualified to make that observation, I need to look elsewhere for some study, something, some source, someone else who's done that work for me. What would be problematic about me just asserting things like that sentence and actually justifying it, saying, well, it's probably true that 100% of abusers are killed, and here's a reason why, and so that's my argument, so I win.
It just sounds like you're making it up and kind of pulling it out of your head. And if your opponent has anything to contradict it or just says that you're not giving a real source, then it can't be credible.
Right, so the way we naturally think about empirical claims as we hear them is that we evaluate them, but we haven't really refined that yet. We do have sort of a gut feeling for when an empirical claim is fully justified. If I just stood up in a debate round, and even if I gave a warrant for why 100% of abusers are killed, you were still dubious for some reason. You say, but I'm not giving a source, and a source is required. Well, this lecture is going to help you refine that answer so you can take out empirical arguments that other people make. So, for instance, let's say we hear on the news that all teenagers like using black tar heroin, and they found this because they looked at a high school in Peoria, Illinois, and that is what we concluded. Is that true? Well, why isn't it true? Would we naturally assume it's correct and then see if it's false? Why don't we think it's true?
It's based on a lot of kids.
Yeah, so even though it's a credible source, like a news channel, there's no reason why we would believe that that empirical claim.
Can someone give me an answer?
How many girls are wearing skirts compared to how many guys are wearing skirts?
Okay.
Well, how did you reach that conclusion?
Because if you're comparing who likes to learn and watch, then whoever likes to learn would actually learn.
Okay, but the way in which I did that was I did what? Did I like go out on the street and ask people? Did I go up to the advanced lecture series and ask them what was the?
You made an observation in this class.
Yes, in this class specifically, and I made an observation of this group, like these 27 people. So that would be the methodology.
So Kay would probably have to come up with an understanding of what a skirt is. Who's male? Who's female? What are shorts? A methodology. Do I count everyone, or do I count 5 of you and then make conclusions about the percentage of the rest of you? Those are all, and that's just this example, those are all features of the method in which we come to make empirical claims. So if I wanted to make the empirical claim, most nations in the world want to have nuclear weapon stockpiles. How would I have to go about proving that empirical claim? Light blue polo.
So for examining or like trying to figure out how many countries want these nuclear powers, you'd have to go and not just survey like a few countries or ask a few countries or like study a few countries, but instead countries like all around the world.
Good. Yeah. There you go. And then if I were to ask you about your methodology, what would you tell me?
Countries that were surveyed were worldwide.
Okay. So you would specify which countries were surveyed.
Okay.
Good.
So,
Sorry guys, the internet is not working on my computer.
well, the lecture has done it.
Yeah, but if we want to share cards.
If you move your computer around like I could push my other give it to
All line
Okay, so if empirical claims attempt to prove some fact about the world true, where can they be used in a debate case? You in the back sipping your coffee.
In the convention level arguments.
Okay. Well, I would say you can use them mostly anywhere, but I like that. Let's go with that. Why is it useful in a contention level argument?
Because, like, for justifying the standard, you would use something to justify that standard and why. Like, on the contention
What do you
level,
mean by justify the standard first of all?
like, a justification for why your standard is your standard and, like, why you prefer that standard.
Well, we're talking about the
Yeah.
contention.
Yeah, so, like, you're using the contention level arguments. You could use that, like, link in your standard.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
You use that, like, piece of argument, like, the evidence to, like, prove the contention and use that to link to your standard.
Yeah. You use empirics in your contention to help link your contentions back to your standard, to help prove that the action in the resolution links to the standard somehow. So if I wanted to say that the use of deadly force as a response to repeated domestic violence is morally permissible because the person is acting in self-defense, and I read a contention, and my empirics say that studies show that in interviews in shelters of people fleeing houses where there was domestic violence, studies show that women exhibited traits, or the people exhibited traits of using domestic or deadly force as self-defense. They thought they were defending themselves. That's the study. That can help me prove that the action of the resolution is morally permissible because it helps prove empirically that it is a fact about the world that victims use deadly force as self-defense, thus meeting my standard, thus proving the resolution true. So can someone repeat that back to me? You have a new pair of sunglasses every time.
No, I can't.
You can't. Can someone help him out? And no one makes eye contact. Fuck you.
So if you wanted to prove that like victims use self-defense, then you could like get empirical like data to say that like they already are using it, like through observation, and then you can say that since they are using it, like it shows that they use it in self-defense, and so it links back in. Like I don't know if that was very okay.
I thought it was good.
Okay.
If you couldn't hear her, what she said is that if you wanted to prove that the use of deadly force is morally permissible because it's an act in self-defense, what you can do is find a card that says, you know, victims think that they're acting in self-defense, and or some card that says that this is what self-defense is 100% of the time. This is how victims respond with the use of deadly force, and it is an act in self-defense. That is an argument that you can put in your contention to link to your standard, which is our pretend standard in self-defense, and thus the empirics help you prove the resolution true, prove that the use of deadly force is morally permissible, because you're saying what is morally permissible is some action taken in self-defense, and it is a fact about the world that when a person uses deadly force as a response to repeated domestic violence, it is an act in self-defense. So can you repeat that back?
If you want to prove victims use deadly force, using deadly force is more permissible. Self-defense get empirical data to put intention to back in your
That's good. And to make this a little bit harder, we just talked about methodology. What could be one method by which you could get that empirical evidence?
Me?
Yeah.
Okay, a survey?
Okay, good. Easy.
Okay, so what Kay brings up is really important. Let's say your contention relies upon this empirical claim that the use of deadly force is an empirical fact about the world, is that it is always taken in self-defense. That is what your contention rests upon. But oh my God, your opponent stands up and reads a card that says the opposite, that 0% of the time it is never taken in self-defense because interviews show in a couple of shelters that the victims were like, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't feel threatened, but I was just, you know, I felt like taking preemptive action. So they have a card or evidence that makes the opposite claim about the world. It is saying that almost never does a victim think of it as self-defense. They might think of it as necessary or something else, but they tend to think of it as preemptive action, and that's because interviews in some particular shelters. What happens if you don't respond to this argument?
You lose the argument
Yeah, why do you lose the argument?
because they made a card that contradicted you and you didn't acknowledge it.
Yeah, so if your job is to show that the use of deadly force is an action taken in self-defense, and that rests upon you proving that it is an empirical fact about the world, because that's how you wrote your case, and then make an opposing claim, also using empirical evidence, and you don't engage that debate, you lose your argument, which means that you can't win off of that argument. Which is why it is absolutely essential to be able to know how to win those empirical arguments.
So, what might be some methods that just occur to you of how you could compare the two pieces of evidence? Ryan,
Source credibility.
source credibility. What does that mean?
Like maybe dictionary.com versus a tenured professor or something like that. Like how they got the information.
You'd be
who's
hard
saying it.
pressed to find a dictionary.com.
Okay, so in this specific example, we have we have two claims. One says women in shelters say that they were acting in self-defense. The other says no, women in shelters say, I felt like killing him. So how would you compare those two?
Compare methodologies.
Okay. Again, that's where we're going. But what specifically? What part of it, Caitlin?
It's like the size of the data pool. Like if there's more people asked, then it's more credible than a really small specific pool of people.
Okay, fine. That's one good way. What other way could we ask? What if the data pool? What if one person was asking at a shelter for battered women, and one group of surveys, and the other group of surveys were taking place at a prison for violent female felons. So we have data pool, we have size of data pool. What else could we say about our data pool? Yeah.
I guess the people and their psychological state.
Okay, the psychological state. So, Kimberly?
Where the survey was taken?
Where the survey was taken, and specifically, why does where the survey was taken matter?
Because, like you said, if it was a women's shelter and a prison, then it's more likely that the one person was found guilty, meaning that they didn't do it for self-defense.
Okay.
When it was taken?
When it was taken? So that's an interesting answer. If I took one survey in 2000 and one survey in 2001, which would you prefer?
It depends what it's about. Because if it's about terrorism, then yeah.
Okay.
The 2001.
We have discussed this example before. Let's try 2004 and 2005.
Then it doesn't really matter unless a significant event happened that specifically relates to that piece of evidence.
So what could be a significant event which changes your survey?
Like the Cold War and nuclear threat.
I don't want stuff like that.
Okay, you guys, nice job remembering what we've already talked about. I am actually proud of you though. Okay. Does anyone have any other ideas about what could matter? Yeah.
If it's a prison, they might have taken in more prisoners or lost some prisoners in the span of a year.
Okay. So the consistency of the data pool. That is a good answer, but it's generally hard. Like people don't say that in their surveys. So I'm glad you thought about it. It generally doesn't show up when people are reading it. Are you just brushing your hair, or do you have a?
Oh yeah, I don't have an answer.
Okay.
Okay, so what I like about these answers is that we're sort of broadening the way we examine empirical claims. So it's not just where it comes from, but it's what is the data set? It's the number of data that we have. They're all data.
I think so, yeah.
It's the type of data we have. It's where we're getting it. It's when we're getting it. So these are all descriptions and criticisms of the content of the empirical claim. They are criticisms of how we go, they're criticisms of how the content of an empirical claim was generated. So it's a criticism of the specific methodology. Another thing you can do in criticizing empirical claims is not merely the way in which those empirical claims are generated, so not merely criticizing the data or the source, but also the sort of conclusions that are forced upon the empirical claims as well. So let's say I did a study, and I said, that, this is a very generic example, but I said that in the year 2010, ice cream sales went up, and so did car robberies. And the conclusion I make from understanding that from understanding those statistical claims, the conclusion I forced upon my empirical observation is that obviously, for some reason, the fact that more people are getting ice cream means that they really want to go rob cars, and so they do. Just intuitively, does that make any sense? Why doesn't that make any sense?
The two events are related.
They aren't necessarily related.
Yeah.
I mean, they could be related by some feature.
What about a little bit more? That's one that's like ice cream and car robberies. You got that one fast, right? But what about if I say, countries which have more nuclear weapons don't engage in wars as often? Then am I proving a causation? Is that sufficient to show that having nuclear weapons leads to a decrease in wars?
No.
The ice cream part is the nukes part. The car robbery part is the war part.
Yeah.
I guess, like for the ice cream one, I guess you will have to prove what in the ice cream makes people want to rob cars or take cars.
Okay.
So, yes, it could just be, that they're unrelated. It could be that there is some bizarre explanation as to why that actually does happen. Or it could be that there's a common cause for both, in which case the two don't have any causal relationship, but they do have a common origin. But that doesn't help you in the way of proving your claim. So I could say, it's really hot outside. That leads to two conclusions, two completely different conclusions that are entirely unrelated. It's really hot outside, so people like to get ice cream. It's really hot outside, so people leave their windows down in their cars to let the air out or whatever. If you can make those kinds of criticisms and make those kinds of observations, you can prove that the sort of conclusions we impose on statistics aren't founded. And let me tell you, the issue with empirics, the issue with making observations about the world, is it is extremely hard to prove causal relationships. It is extremely hard because there is a lot that goes on in the world, and it is not as simple as saying, hey, countries have nukes, there's no more war, there's obviously a relationship.
So can someone give me the 3 different types of relationships that there could be between 2 separate facts? So like, sales of ice cream rise, car robberies rise. What are the 3 different kinds of relationships that we've talked about? Yeah.
They have the same origins, but it's different.
Okay, so they have separate origins, different conclusions. So do they cause one another?
No.
Okay, 1. 2? Anyone? Yeah.
They actually cause one another?
Good. 3? This is the easy one, guys.
They don't cause them.
Okay, and more than they don't cause one another, they're completely unrelated. Okay.
So we've sort of divided thinking about empirics in 2 ways. The first is criticizing sort of the content that informs, or the methodology that informs the conclusion of the, or that informs the facts of the empirics. So the data set, who we're talking about, when we're asking them, who the source is, when it's peer reviewed, blah, 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 blah. The second way we think about empirical arguments is analyzing the conclusions we impose on them. Are the empirics doing enough to get to the conclusions that they themselves say? Are the empirics doing enough to show a causal relationship? This is important because the whole point of empirics is to use facts about the world to draw some conclusions. But as we will keep in mind throughout the rest of this exercise, it's really, really hard to prove a causal relationship using empirics alone.
So if someone just gives you two numbers, the ice cream, you guys know that example, that homicides, or that when people use, or when the number of violent female felons rises, there's also the number of drug-related deaths rises. Does that prove anything? No.
Although it could be used in a case. Someone could be like, I found this card that when people use deadly force, it leads to drug violence, and that is why the resolution is not true, because it's obviously not morally permissible to allow for actions that increase drug violence. But that, as Kate says, you can easily take it out based upon the discussion we've just had. Simply stating two concurrent empirical claims in the same sentence doesn't mean that there's any relationship between them at all.
How would you phrase that response? Can someone give me the response that you would say in round? This is a little harder. No one makes eye contact. I'm going to start calling on people. Still no one's breath? Okay, Shane, you're making eye contact.
Alright, their argument isn't true because the relationship between what their card says and the conclusion they're making is unrelated, because just because drug use increases and domestic violence increases, that doesn't mean there's any causal relationship between the two.
Okay, so that's, remember when we talked about no warrant arguments last week?
Mm-hmm.
You've done the first part of a no warrant very well. What else? You need to give me one more thing to completely solidify that argument.
Well, I don't remember what the other part is.
You need to provide an alternative cause. So, if someone's someone gives you two statistics about domestic violence and about drug rates, you could say, well, my opponent says they're related by this, but without any evidence, you could just as well say when people are, that there's a third cause, which is when people are very threatened by their abusers, both domestic violence rates increase and women are taking more drugs to, escape from the situation. So you can, give an alternative, if no causality is provided, give an alternative causality or set of causes to demonstrate that your claim is just as valid as theirs, and without further warrants or further evidence, there's no reason to look to their claim. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Vivian, does that make sense to you? Can you repeat it?
So basically you give an alternative to the so-called warrant.
You give an alternative to what?
To their so-called warrant, even if they don't use deadly force, they will still use something like that. Even if the abusers still have force, they'll use drugs to escape from so it doesn't have to use deadly force. No, it doesn't matter if they use deadly force.
Yeah.
Good. So I think we have a fairly solid footing on how to think about empirical cards. So let's go back to the original scenario way back when, about how you have a standard and you have an empirical claim that warrants the contention that links to your standard. So let's say your standard is self-defense. You have a contention that says interviews with women say that they do it out of self-defense. Here are the features of self-defense. They actually do it in self-defense. That is a fact about the world. And let's say the negative has occurred. So it says, you know what, they don't do it in self-defense. They interviews show, because of blah, blah, blah methodology, that they intend to do it. But it wasn't a reaction, it was premeditated, it was, they knew they were gonna do it, they planned it ahead of time, that was based upon some interviews with women in a battered women's shelter somewhere in Appalachia, I don't know. What do you do in that instance? You're saying one thing, they're saying the opposite thing. They both link to your standard, so they're both ways for you, they're both ways for either side to win.
You challenge the methodology of the survey?
Yeah. Well, yeah, that is one method. But let me refine that a little. You do definitely want to problematize the methodology of their study. But what if?
So what are ways that you could do that? You just went over like 5 different ways.
Couldn't you just, as a rebuttal, if you're talking about your opponent's claims, and that doesn't really make sense, then you could just stand up and say the methodology of their claims doesn't fully make sense. Or during stakes, you could ask them about it.
Okay, what specifically, but like methodology could be anything, right? So what specifically could you say?
You can like question the conclusion that was like derived from the like piece of evidence.
Okay, that is one good way. But let's talk about just kind of the ways that you collect data, that part of the methodology. How could you challenge those? Sam?
We compared sample size or when it was taken.
Okay. So let's say that your sample size is 50 people and their sample size is 300 people. Would you want to compare it on that basis? No. So can you just say they only have a sample size of 300 people, which means that they're just not surveying enough people because they're 300 million people in the US, you guys, this is not giving us an accurate picture. Would you want to say something like that?
No.
No. So what does methodology have to be? What did responses yet?
Comparative?
Yes.
Did everyone hear the word that she said? She said the word comparative because it makes almost no sense to criticize their argument if that criticism applies to your empirical claim as well. Which means that, yes, in arguing their empirical warrant, you do want to point out something that they have wrong that is not wrong in your empirical claim, but you also want to go the further step, just in case, to explain why your empirical claim also doesn't have that flaw.
Jose, can you explain why, why when you make an attack on methodology, it has to be comparative? Okay.
Someone help him out?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you have to prove that, we have to explain why your empirical claim doesn't have that flaw, so it's better than theirs.
Okay. Jose,
That's proof why your thought doesn't have that claim.
you have to prove.
Why your thought or your claim doesn't have that sorry, I just got the claim part. I didn't hear it.
Yeah, you have to explain why your empirical claim doesn't have that flaw, so it's better than theirs.
Because otherwise.
Because otherwise it's not as valid as yours.
Okay, so let's say my opponent has a definition from dictionary.com, and I think that is incredibly dumb. But I also have a definition from dictionary.com, and it's really important to my case. And I stand up and say, Judge, this is so stupid. Here are 58 reasons why dictionary.com is so bad. what would they say in that instance?
She uses the straight up one.
Yeah, I do it too. So at most, or like at absolute best, it's a wash. But that doesn't get me anywhere. I don't want it to just have a wash. I want to win off my argument. I don't want to respond to their argument and in doing so also respond to my argument. I want to just take theirs out and win mine. That is the ideal scenario. So if I criticize their argument for the same flaw that I had too, that's really bad because I can't win off my own argument if they're an intelligent enough debater to point that out, and they probably will be.
So Jose, can you explain why arguments have to, why evidence compared, why you have to, when you criticize someone else's evidence, you have to be comparative?
Because you don't want to hurt your flaw or what you're trying to prove.
Yeah.
So this means that not only do you want to know how to respond to empirical warrants, but you want to, when you are finding empirical warrants for your own case, criticize them and test them to see if they're actually sufficient to prove the claim that you want to make true. You don't want to be left in the position of trying to hide some flaw from the judge. You want to be very critical. You want to look at the methodology behind the card before you use it as evidence in your case. You want to see if the conclusions imposed upon the empirical claims is actually valid. So, in thinking about the empirical debate, you want to first find empirical claims that are sufficiently warranted with a good methodology that probably comes from a credible source, and at the same time, use that criticisms in approaching someone else's empirical claims in a debate round.
So what are some of the things, and like the way that you would format this in a debate case is like you don't have to read like the full, this was a study done on 500 people like in this prison at this time. You don't have to read that in most cases. You should just have it kind of footnoted or endnoted somewhere. But what are some of the things you would want to include when you have empirical evidence? What's some of the information that you have available should your opponent ask? Ria.
If you're presenting empirical evidence, like you should be able to say like, well, they didn't just like survey 5 people, like they asked like 1,500 people, or like it was a tenured professor. It wasn't just like some guy who asked people on the street, like have reasons why your empirical evidence not only applies to the debate round, but is also valid evidence.
So the tenured professor is a good point. We haven't talked about that. We haven't talked about sources. What sources are good in a debate round? Brian.
News channels like BBC or something like that, they directly come out and say it's an actual objective report.
Would you want a news channel to talk about, this is specifically the way that you process nuclear fuel, and because this is the way that you process nuclear fuel, do you want it to give like an exact, like rigorous scientific claim or a precise claim in the field, or would you prefer another source for that?
For a source like nuclear power, you'd want some type of a nuclear engineer or scientist.
Good. So if I had a professor, but the professor was from the American History Department, would that be like, and I was talking about nuclear power or something, would that be a good source?
Depends.
It depends.
What does it depend on?
Depends on how much they know about nuclear weapons. Because this point is to know about nuclear weapons.
Okay. That is a good point.
But
So what if they're from like, sorry.
They may not exactly know about how the exact scientifics of the nuclear weapon works. I mean, they might know about how they're used and stuff, but like if you have a nuclear engineer versus a history professor, the nuclear engineer would be preferable, right?
Okay, so like what if we had an English professor talking about how the word nuclear was derived and that was like a really like terrible connotation because it oppressed women. I actually had a friend who did this case. Would you prefer that to something about a nuclear engineer? The question was, what are the mechanics of nuclear weapons? Okay. So it's not just do they have a doctor in front of their name, it's also what is their field.
And keep in mind, people with PhDs sometimes make the silliest claims. So even if the source seems credible, that doesn't mean that you can be like, awesome, I don't have to analyze the validity of this card at all. In fact, some of the strangest cards I've ever seen in debate are written by PhDs.
What if it's a blog by a PhD professor versus a general book by a citizen reporter? Anyone have an idea of how you would compare those? There are multiple answers to this question.
How about you in the blue shirt? Because we can't talk to you.
The question was the blog versus like.
A blog written by a tenured professor in, let's say, nuclear engineering versus a book written by a citizen journalist who doesn't have any specific training in nuclear weapons.
I use the blog because they have more experience.
Okay, that's one reason. Are there any claims for why you would prefer the opposite, why you would prefer the book?
Well, you have to question like what the purpose of like the blog or the book was.
Okay. What about, so did the blog have to go through anyone to get published?
Yeah, for instance, the book had to get like edited and then published and went through a lot of other people, whereas in a blog you can just write whatever you want, even if it's really reality.
Okay, so you would prefer the book.
Yeah, I think so. Well, I mean, PhD, so. I don't know.
So you can make arguments on different levels, right? There's no absolute reason why one is better than another. Remember that, because your opponent's definitely going to explain why your evidence is bad. So.
Yeah, I think too. So what?
Do you agree with that?
Yeah. So what happens in the instance that you have two cards linking to the same standard? One comes from a source of someone who wrote a blog, but they have a PhD, and the other one comes from a journalist like Anderson Cooper, but he wrote a book. And you say, so if you wanted to show that your book is better than their blog-based evidence that says the opposite, and by the way, it links to the standard, so it's also a way for them to win, what do? How do you say that? You in the yellow shirt.
You could say that, like, because the book is a more formal setting, it has to go through more people. It'd be better to just be informal blog.
So what does that mean in terms of background?
It means that it was like fact checked by editors and all the people that run a publishing company to make sure that it was true on the blog. Just went straight from the PhD guy's brain at the end.
What I like about that answer is that it is comparative. It is comparing the specific levels of the cards, which is the sources. But you should give that argument more weight. You should give it more teeth. So you just said that your empirical claim is so much better than theirs, and you're comparative about it, and you gave a reason why a book is better than a blog. Now, how do you explain? So, what is the in-round implication of that? How do you tell that? Why do you say that if both arguments link to the standard? What is the importance of you saying that?
Yours is more likely to be true. Like,
yours is more likely to be true, and why is that important? Would anyone like to help him out? And let me reiterate that these are two arguments that both link to the same standard. One proves your side true, and one proves their side true. So depending on who wins this empirical debate, that's who wins the round. So would anyone like to help him out?
So like, if their evidence is incredible, then it can't really link to the standard, so they wouldn't be able to win off of that. But if yours was credible, you could win off of yours.
And what do you mean by it can't really link to the standard?
Well, like if it's not warranted and stuff. If they're just making that claim, it's not based
You petered off at the end, what did you say?
it's not based on anything.
It's not based on anything?
What do you want me to repeat? What?
The last thing that you said, I just didn't hear it.
Oh, if it's not warranted properly and it's not based on anything, then it can't really be used to understand it.
Okay, so can you tell him that?
If their claim isn't warranted properly and not based on anything, then it can't link to their to the standard and they can't win off of that. But if yours does, then you can win off of yours.
So can you win around with an argument that's just like, I negate because I said so? Can you? Who said yes?
If they can't prove it wrong.
No, you can't. You have to prove things. Debate is not a competition of throwing opinions at each other. You have to actually prove something. If they can't prove why it's not self-defense and thus links to the standard, if they can't prove their side because you're taking out a critical part of their empirical claim, which is how they're supposed to win the round, they can't win because they don't have a sufficient argument to prove their side true. Which means that because it links to the standard and it is offense, and you're showing a critical flaw that makes the truth of the claim very, very dubious, you tell the judge that they can't possibly vote off of this and to prefer your beautifully warranted and cut empirical claim that links perfectly to the standard.
So someone, this is the last question, someone give the full explanation of the case in which we have the PhD blogger versus the journalist book, and you are arguing that the journalist book writer is a better source. So give the full argument for that. Yeah.
Okay, so it was just something like their warrant isn't very good because the blog doesn't have to go through any editors or anything to verify that it's true, whereas my empirical data has to go through publishers and editors, etc. So you should prefer mine over theirs, thus doing your standard data.
What I especially liked is the use of the word whereas, which indicates that you are really doing the work to compare the credibility of their card versus yours. And I especially like how the explanation of how it means that they can't link to the standard because the argument that they would be linking it to is fundamentally flawed in some regard and isn't doing its work to show that the claims are true. That is it for this pack. We continue.
Wait, but this case is 10 pages. Our CX case was 8 or no, 13 pages. Their schedule? Right here. Yeah, we're going to the labs. We have labs. Yeah. The reason why labs Trey, wait. So we have lab, lunch, lecture, until 12:30, so an hour and a half.
I'm not used to the 2 hours.
Yeah, I know. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Split.
Or wait. I thought it was Shane's computer. Should we go back?
I guess it's not like an actual specific case. No, that's not.
You were really good at typing your calculator.
I didn't have any cases on that. So how did you know?
You would literally
Hey, what are you trying to say?